Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank my colleague, Senator Murphy, my friend and partner in so many different issues, and most especially on measures to stop gun violence in this country, common sense, sensible measures that he has championed so ably, and I've been very proud to work with him as a partner in spearheading as well. And I want to join in explaining my reasons that I am unable to vote for the bill that we are considering today, the bill that is presented for cloture this afternoon. People in the United States have a Second Amendment right to possess and use firearms. It is guaranteed by the Constitution, and there are legitimate ways and means that people can use firearms in this country, recreational and sometimes commercial. Those rights are guaranteed by the Constitution, and this measure arguably is in service of those rights. But I can't vote for a measure that makes owning or possessing or using guns more readily or easily usable when we have failed to act, and we have failed to act on common sense, sensible measures that will stop gun violence. I voted to achieve cloture on a measure very similar to this one before Sandy Hook and before the necessary 60 votes was failed on this measure a year ago, April. I can see the legitimate reasons to vote for this bill and to support cloture, but not when this body has failed in its fundamental obligation to make America safer and to rid it of gun violence. We have an obligation to take first things first and protect our children, and to adopt the kind of common sense measures, background checks, mental health initiatives, school safety, a ban on illegal trafficking that are easily within reach and would be passed by a majority of this body if presented for another vote, and if a majority of members voting was sufficient, rather than the 60 votes that is now our threshold. I'm reminded today of a victim of gun violence over this very weekend, in the early mornings of Sunday. A young woman in Bridgeport who was gunned down by her ex-boyfriend, raging into her mother's house, first shooting her mother's boyfriend and then turning his gun on her because she had the audacity to end their relationship. Her story puts a face on the reason that I've offered a measure named after another victim of gun violence to impose common sense steps to take away guns from people who are under temporary restraining orders as well as permanent restraining orders. Whether that kind of measure would have worked in this case is irrelevant. Her death was unnecessary and preventable, tragic and painful to her family, not to mention her mom, who was in the house at the time she was gunned down and murdered. Her death occurred within 75 minutes of another death in Bridgeport on the east side when Abraham A.B. Davison, 23-year-old young man sitting on his house porch in Barnum Avenue in Bridgeport, again, gunned down. In the case of Karomi Fontanes, a young woman who was shot by her ex-boyfriend, Jose Santiago was apprehended almost immediately and gave a confession. The case, according to the Bridgeport police, is closed. But The chief of the Bridgeport Police, Chief Gaudet, had this to say, quote, 3 separate incidents, 6 people shot, 2 people dead. I'm very proud of the work that all of our officers do every day, but especially last night. It was a really trying night last night, and Chief Gaudet committed himself to begin a renewed effort against domestic violence, inspired by the death of this young woman, Karomi Fontanez. Already in Connecticut, we have exceeded the number of domestic violence deaths that occurred in all of last year. Her death was the 10th in 2014 alone. Domestic violence takes a terrible, awful, unacceptable toll in lives and injuries, heartbreak and pain, and it is so avoidable and unnecessary. We need to do more about domestic violence, but as my colleague, Senator Murphy, has commented so well, the chances of death as a result of domestic violence are increased by 5 times when there's a gun in the house. Guns and domestic violence are a dangerous, toxic mix. And that's the reason for our legislation, the legislation that we have offered that takes away guns, stops purchases and ownership of guns when there are restraining orders, when there is an objective reason to think that there will be this kind of threat of violence and rage and wrath. The memory of these 2 people who died just yesterday morning, in the early hours of the Sunday following Independence Day, should focus our attention again on what is important, what should be our priority, what should be our first steps when it comes to guns, and that is to make America safer. 4 months after the brutal murders in Sandy Hook, this body said no to the grieving Newtown families, to the people of Connecticut, and to the vast majority of American people who continue to support common sense measures like background check. This body voted to prevent gun violence legislation from getting a final vote. Today we will vote on a sportsman's bill, whether it should have a final vote. And the fact that we are now considering this legislation to expand recreational shooting on federal lands without addressing the scourge of gun violence is a stark reminder of the Congress's misplaced priorities and unfulfilled obligation. I sympathize with what my great colleague, Senator Hagan, is trying to do. If the legislation we're considering today were part of a broader national discussion and conversation about who should possess guns and how we should keep them out of the hands of dangerous people, criminals, and mentally troubled people who are dangerous to themselves or others, it would be a different debate on the floor, and the considerations for me would be different in this vote. I spent last week going from town to town in Connecticut listening to constituents ask me, what are you doing in Washington? And a lot of it was, what are you doing in Washington to stop gun violence? When will you bring back the measures to stop gun violence that are the legacy and the lesson of Sandy Hook? The tragedy that still causes so much pain to so many people, thinking of those families, the 20 beautiful children and brave educators whose lives were lost that day. I am unable to go back to Connecticut and tell those people who asked me about what we are doing to stop gun violence in America that what we've done is to make it easier for Americans to shoot at targets, make it easier for big game trophy hunters to bring their polar bear rugs back from Canadian hunting lodges, and to reduce regulations that govern shell cases. That's not my idea of where our priority should be. First things first, let's stop gun violence. Let's at least take steps to reduce its horrific toll of death and injury, its costs in dollars. Let's try to find that bipartisan ground on reducing domestic violence or reaching out to people who need mental health treatment. And let's find common ground on making America safer. That common ground serves our best instincts. What makes our nation the greatest nation in the history of the world, a nation whose independence we celebrated this weekend with pride and joy, even as the terrible toll of gun violence continued in yesterday's early morning, over the weekend throughout America, where tens of thousands of deaths have followed the tragic, horrific, unspeakable tragedy of Sandy Hook. I will vote today against this legislation, against invoking cloture, with sadness and regret that that obligation and promise is as yet unfulfilled. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.